Syria as we know it has fallen, with Bashar al Assad now being excommunicated from the seat of power as he was chased out of the country by the moderate rebels, and he has now been sent packing, fleeing to Russia to take safe haven in Moscow. And the thing that I find so interesting about this is that the way this has been framed by the corporate press, specifically when talking about the moderate rebels that have now taken power after deposing Assad, well, we would understand one thing, and that would be the nature of the moniker that they once wore and still do in many ways. And what would that be? Well, it would be Al Qaeda and Al Nusra, as we can understand that the man who is leading them, Al Jalani, well, he was wanted by what? The U.S. Embassy, of all things, for $10 million a bounty because of the fact that he was targeting U.S. servicemen in Iraq. That's right, someone who is with that of Al Qaeda targeting U.S. servicemen in Iraq and Afghanistan. As we well know, this is the evolution of what we have seen with the Mujahideen, understanding that the funding of what we did in the 1970s with the Mujahideen to assist in the Soviet-Afghan war by attempting to bleed the Soviets dry by getting them to overextend with an imperialist overexpansion into Afghanistan itself, an incredibly mountainous terrain that was nothing more than a folly as we knew it then, which we apparently did not know it now, as we spent roughly $4 trillion in that country, causing nothing more than calamity and decay, to cause it to turn over in 20 years from the Taliban to the Taliban. Truly remarkable, and you would think that we very well may have learned a lesson, but no, it doesn't appear so. Whether it be the fact of what we saw with Saddam Hussein being deposed in Iraq, the fact of the Taliban being ousted in Afghanistan to then just put the Taliban back into power, or what we saw with Libya falling to what is now a failed state where Gaddafi was effectively sodomized to death by that of the moderate rebels of his time. And with it, we now see that Libya is a country that has open-air slave markets. That's right, an absolute disaster for those within the borders of this nation. But does that matter to the Western moneymen that seek to push their advances and their standards across that of places like the Middle East? No, of course not. So now let's go ahead, jump in, and see what we've got with the insanity of the fall of Syria. You can realistically take the downfall of Syria all the way back to the creation of the PNAC document in the early 90s, which, for those who are unfamiliar, the PNAC document being the Project for a New American Century, which was the ideal that the American government was going to be able to create American hegemony across that of the world, not only because of the fact that it was good for America, but the world, which this being something that was helmed by people like Bill Kristol and Douglas Feith, as well as David Wurmser. This was pushed consistently throughout the halls of Washington, D.C., and now we see with the ever-expanding evolution of the neoconservative doctrine that has proliferated throughout Washington and does so in the current era, we realize that it has led to nothing more than disaster. As we have seen, we are now $36 trillion in debt. But we're not going to go ahead and focus specifically on what we saw going on with that in the Project for a New American Century, but we will be touching on it, and just to do that, we'll go ahead and let someone that is far more credible than I do so, and that would be one General Wesley Clark, as he explains to you, well, it seems that we had the desire to overthrow 7 countries in 5 years, and with that, one of them being Syria. And what's so interesting about this is we've effectively gotten every single one of these countries now on this list, except for the big one in that of Iran. And what it reminds me of is the fact that the U.S. government, much like many times we see with government in any way, shape, or form, even at the local level, is very inefficient in achieving the desired end goals within the time scale that it establishes. And you can simply look at things like construction zones that are created by that of government projects that have a desired time frame to be ended within, which of course they almost never meet. And what does that bring us to a realization of? That you should also be able to extrapolate that mindset outwards and look at it on the scale of what we see with global projects as well. Because as we see with the desire to overthrow 7 countries in 5 years, well, it seems that we've consistently now overthrown 6 countries, but it was over 20 years. So it just seems that we ended up dropping our ball on the time frame. So now I'll go ahead and give it away to General Wesley Clark so he can go ahead and explain this to you. And if you have not seen this clip, I must admit it is truly quite edifying.
Right after 9/11, about 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who had used to work for me, and one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you got come in, you got to come in and talk to me a second. I said, well, you're too busy. He said, no. He says, we've made the decision, we're going to war with Iraq. This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, we're going to war with Iraq. Why? He said, I don't know. He said, I guess they don't know what else to do. So I said, well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda? He said, no. He says, there's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq. He said, I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments. And he said, I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail. So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, are we still going to war with Iraq? And he said, oh, it's worse than that. He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, this is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran. I said, is it classified? He said, yes, sir. I said, well, don't show it to me. And I saw him a year or so ago, and I said, you remember that? He said, sir, I didn't show you that memo. I didn't show it to you.
I'm sorry, what did you say his name was?
I'm not going to give you his name.
So go through the countries again.
Well, starting with Iraq, then Syria and Lebanon, then Libya, then Somalia and Sudan, and then back to Iran.
There is honestly so much I have to say about that clip that it is unreal, and I could fill an entire video with it. But alas, we're going to go ahead and try and cut that short so we can go ahead and get back to what we were trying to focus on, which is what's on your screen, Operation Timber Sycamore, which was the CIA funding the anti-Assad rebels to attempt to oust the Assad regime during the Syrian civil war. Anyways, back to what we saw with General Wesley Clark and what he had to say. There are some fascinating things about what he touches on there that even when I see some of the most, I would argue, prolific people within that of the independent media landscape that are analyzing things like what they're seeing coming out of these top tier generals and many of the people within Washington, D.C., when I see them talk about this clip, they miss one of the most important points. And it's what he says about when he learned about the fact that we were going to be going to war with Iraq. And that was in early September of 2001. When did we actually go into Iraq to invade? In March of 2003. So what we can see is before there was even a general consensus amongst the American people, the American government and the upper echelon of the neoconservative establishment that was controlling American foreign policy had decided that we were going to war with Iraq. And what is it that they realized? That they needed to propagandize the American people endlessly, and that is exactly what they did on repeat for the following year, claiming that if we don't hit them over there, they're going to hit us back here again. Look at that. They have weapons of mass destruction. We need to go to Iraq because the people who are responsible for this, well, they have these weapons that are now more impactful than a plane into a tower. And if we don't stop this, they're going to be dropping nukes in Kansas. This was quite literally the line of argumentation that was delivered to us. But of course, that's not something that people within that of the corporate press or the government that advocated for the conflicts that we have seen cause nothing more than calamity even talk about in any way, shape, or form, nor many of the people who are actually within the independent media landscape that should be picking up on how relevant of a topic that is. Anyways, on to the fact of what he says with 7 countries in 5 years, we can realize that 6 of those 7 countries have now been toppled, and many of the times by the moderate rebels, as they claim, and with it what we can see is, in many different ways, those countries fall to absolute disaster as the possibility for Syria very well may be on the horizon, especially with the fall of the Assad regime now opening a door for the more zealot-minded people within that of the walls of Syria to operate with impunity as they persecute those who they see as their opposition, because we understand that things like the Islamic State and that of ISIS have a desire to persecute anyone who does not profess the nobility of Allah. And what is so stunning about this is that this is not something that's going to even be talked about by the mainstream media. They will completely avoid the topic of the persecution of Christians, the Kurds, the Alawites, or the Druze, and bypass every single avenue that they could possibly take take to end up at that conversation, because it's not something that they want to address. Thus, they will avoid it at every single turn. Now, let's go ahead and jump back into what I intended to talk about with Operation Timber Sycamore. Timber Sycamore was a classified weapons supply and training program run by the United States Central Intelligence Agency and supported by some Arab intelligence services, including Saudi intelligence. Launched in 2012 or 2013, it supplied money, weaponry, and training to Syrian opposition groups fighting Syrian government forces in the Syrian civil war. According to U.S. officials, the program was run by the CIA's Special Activities Division, which has trained thousands of rebels. President Barack Obama secretly authorized the CIA to begin arming Syria's embattled rebels in 2013. The program then became public knowledge in mid-2016. One consequence of the program has been a flood of U.S. weapons, including assault rifles, mortars, and rocket-propelled grenades into the Middle East black market. Critics of the program within the Obama administration viewed it as ineffective and expensive, raising concerns about the seizure of weaponry by Islamist groups and about Timber Sycamore-backed rebels fighting alongside the al-Nusra Front and its allies. In July 2017, U.S. officials stated that Timber Sycamore would be phased out, with funds possibly redirected to fighting the Islamic State or to offering rebel forces defensive capabilities. On now to the creation, we see CIA Director David Petraeus first proposed a covert program of arming and training rebels in the summer of 2012. Initially, President Obama rejected the proposal but later agreed, partially due to lobbying by foreign leaders, including King Abdullah II of Jordan and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And would you look at that? One Benjamin Netanyahu advocating for the overthrow of the Syrian government. And the thing is, this is nothing new. Because whether it's the current day or taking this all the way back to 2002 when Benjamin Netanyahu came to the United States to talk before our Congress and speak as a regional expert and testify about the fact of the actions that we needed to take in the Middle East, what is it that he stated? That we needed to overthrow these 7 countries that were spoken of by General Wesley Clark. And in fact, the thing that's so remarkable about that specifically is the nature of the arguments that were put forward by Benjamin Netanyahu is actually the line of propaganda that was used on the American people that was propagandizing them into being emotionally activated into supporting our war in Iraq with our next invasion that we started in March of 2003. Because Benjamin Netanyahu was the one who was stating that, well, you see, Saddam's going to go genocidal. He has weapons of mass destruction, don't you understand? And because of that fact, because he has these weapons of mass destruction that he most certainly has, and I'm not lying about, he's going to use them on American soil, and you're going to have something that's worse than 10 9/11s unfold on your shores. These were the arguments that were made by Benjamin Netanyahu to advance Israel's ambitions within the region. And because of this, we can understand that this very much mirrors the sentiments of what we see going on with the Greater Israel Project when we look at the actual borders that have been drawn on the map created by Netanyahu that he actually recently had presented to the United States Congress in 2023. And what we need to understand is that the Greater Israel Project involves taking parts of Jordan, parts of Syria, and parts of Saudi Arabia, as well as all of Palestine, whether it be Gaza or the West Bank, which the West Bank being Judea and Samaria, the incredibly significant portion of the region that is most focal to Israel's desires, specifically when it involves Palestine, because they say this is a region where the majority of the events that happened within the Bible had happened. So it is religiously significant for them to have control of this land. Thus, that is why it is one of their main focuses. And there's an argument that the consistent bombing of Gaza is something to draw the eyes of the world upon it so they can seize more land within that of the West Bank itself. I'm not sure if that's the case, but alas, it would not surprise considering the nature of how Israel operates. And speaking of how Israel operates, why don't we just go ahead and let the man himself who's leading the country, Benjamin Netanyahu, speak about how Israel has now seized the Golan Heights, and you can see almost with the smile that he's trying to hide but cannot keep bereft beneath his cheeks that he is ecstatic that they are finally making an advance into Syria to take more land and push for the conquest of these standards that would be seen by the greater world as the Greater Israel Project.
This is a historic day for the Middle East. The collapse of the Assad regime, the tyranny in Damascus, offers great opportunity, but also is fraught with significant dangers. This collapse is a direct result of our forceful action against Hezbollah and Iran, Assad's main supporters It set off a chain reaction of all those who want to free themselves from this tyranny and its oppression. But it also means we have to take action against possible threats. One of them is the collapse of the Separation of Forces Agreement from 1974 between Israel and Syria. This agreement held for 50 years. Last night it collapsed. The Syrian army abandoned its positions. We gave the Israeli army the order to take over these positions to ensure that no hostile force embeds itself right next to the border of Israel. This is a temporary defensive position until a suitable arrangement is found. Equally, we send a hand of peace to all those beyond our border in Syria, to the Druze, to the Kurds, to the Christians, and to the Muslims who want to live in peace with Israel. We're going to follow events very carefully. If we can establish neighborly relations and a peaceful relations with the new forces emerging in Syria, that's our desire. But if we do not, we'll do whatever it takes to defend the state of Israel and the border of Israel.
Upon hearing what Benjamin Netanyahu has to say about how this was only about the fall of the Assad regime, and this is about protecting Israel's territory, and that's why they had to seize the Golan Heights, well, if you actually go ahead and do a bit more digging, you would realize that after Assad had fled the country, what happened? Even after Israel had guarantees from the moderate rebels that had taken control of the country that they would be willing and friendly to work with Israel, they bombed and destroyed effectively all of Syria's navy, which should show you that this is not about creating safety for the nation-state of Israel if you had already had talks with the people who are now in control of the new government. No, this is about conquest and control of land, which is exactly what we see the ideal of the Greater Israel Project represents. Jumping back now to what we saw with Operation Timber Sycamore, let's go ahead and get back to the creation of this, and then we'll move on. Here we see Timber Sycamore began in late 2012 or early 2013 and was similar to other Pentagon or CIA-run weapons routing or training programs that were established in previous decades to support foreign rebel forces. Greg Miller and Adam Intis of the Washington Post stated that the operation has served as the centerpiece of the U.S. strategy to press Syrian President Bashar Al Assad to step aside. The program's principal backers were the United States and Saudi Arabia, but it was also supported by some other regional Arab governments and by the United Kingdom. While Saudi Arabia provides money and weaponry, the United States leads training and military equipment. The program was based in Jordan due to the country's proximity to the battlefields in Syria. According to the New York Times, the program initially allowed U.S. forces to train Syrian rebels in the use of military equipment, but not to directly provide the equipment itself. A few months later, however, after its creation, it was amended to allow the CIA to both train and equip rebel forces. Saudi Arabia has provided military equipment, and covert financing of rebel forces has also been providing this to Qatar, Turkey, and Jordan as well. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey shipped thousands of rifles, hundreds of machine guns, and large amounts of ammunition to Syrian rebels in 2012 before the program's launch. The CIA helped arrange some of the arms purchases for the Saudis, including a large deal in Croatia in 2012. A classified U.S. State Department cable signed by the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton reported that Saudi donors were a major support for Sunni militant forces globally, and some American officials worried that rebels were being supported had al-Qaeda ties. Al-Qaeda, of course, being in conjunction with those who were responsible for 9/11 akin to the bin Ladenite terrorists. So what we can realize is that we were not only funding the terrorists that committed the heinous actions of 9/11, but also the ones that were targeting U.S. soldiers after the fact, after we had sent them into the war on terror into the Middle East, because we were reacting to the fact of us being hit at home, so we had to hit them over there. But hitting them over there was realistically sold on nothing more than a lie from Benjamin Netanyahu when he testified as a regional expert before our Congress here in the United States. Absolutely and utterly despicable. And these are things that when people hear them for the first time, it sounds like nonsense. But luckily, we have government cables that get leaked, as well as behind the books phone calls that end up getting leaked as well, that show people like John Kerry talking about what we have to do to institute a new government in Damascus.
Russia is invited in by the legitimate regime. They were invited in, and we're not invited in. We're flying in airspace there where they can turn on the air defense, and we have a very different scene. They are targeted by the opposition, and we are arming. So, and training. The reason Russia came in is because ISIL was getting stronger. Daesh was threatening the possibility of going to Damascus and so forth. And that's why Russia came in, because they didn't want a Daesh government. And they supported Assad. And we know that this was growing. We were watching it. We saw that Daesh was growing in strength. And we thought Assad was threatened. We thought, however, we could probably manage, that Assad might then negotiate. Instead of negotiating, you got Assad. Now you got Putin to support him. So you think the only solution is for somebody to come in and get rid of Assad?
Yes.
That's the only solution.
Yes.
Who's that going to be? Who's going to do that?
3 years ago, I would say you, but right now I don't know.
What we're trying to do is help Syrians to fight for their own country. And we've been spending a lot of money, a lot of effort to try to help do this. So there's an opposition there. The opposition is doing very well. Russia came in. That's a problem, I know, because we don't behave like Russia. It's just a different standard. We're trying to empower Syrians to be able to fight against this guy. Now the Russians have changed the equation, unfortunately. The Russians have changed the equation.
That really says it all. It just reveals the entirety of the hand that they're playing, because as you see, the only thing in their understanding of how their end goal can be achieved is the overthrow of the Assad regime. And we realize that even taking this all the way back to Benjamin Netanyahu speaking to our Congress in 2002, or even before that with the PNAC document in 1991, we come to the realization that the overthrow of a government such as this under the leadership of the Assad family has been in the works for longer than many of the people who are now in politics have been alive, which is something that we need to draw an understanding of, that we are dealing with forces that are working on such a time scale that it truly dwarfs the understanding of how many people perceive the operational ethos of political reality. And that is one of the most crucial factors to pay attention to going forward when you realize how it is that foreign policy ordeals operate. I'm going to go ahead and call it there. Thank you for watching. If you got this far, thumbs up if you liked it, thumbs down if you didn't. Tell me where I'm wrong in the comment section down below. Stay lovely, stay great, and most importantly, my friends, please go tell someone you love them. Peace out.